Here we go. Hey folks, so Max here behind the camera. With me are Tim, Ben, Mark, and Rob to talk about the ability system. Tim, take it away.
So this is sort of the second stream we've done talking about what we're calling rehabilitation, which is us overhauling our ability and combat system for a myriad of reasons. We did a stream before this. Might be awesome if Max or somebody could drop the link into chat later so that people can go watch that old stream if they want. I just now thought about that. But basically, what we talked about before, and this stream will be somewhat technical because you've got 3 engineers and a designer who is a fairly technical-ish designer.
He's technical.
Yeah. I didn't want to call him a technical designer because that's a whole other thing.
That is a different job.
But,
technically, that's true.
Right, yeah. You shut your face.
Hey.
So the last stream we did was really technical in terms of the direction we were taking our combat system with our entity component model and our eventing and all of that, and we'll rehash just a teensy bit of that as it relates to what we're talking about today. But before it was, here's the direction we're taking the system. Today we want to get into a little bit more of like a combination of progress update, and here's some of the cool shit we can do, here's what we've been working on, here's where we're going. All of that. So I think the bulk of it is mostly going to be the direction we've taken the ability system, the new features we've added to it, and hopefully Ben and Rob have dug the deepest into the specifics of the abilities. I worked a bunch on one particular class, and the knowledge I have of that I'll call out, but seems like last time we did this, you guys really, really liked hearing about specifics, and we like talking about specifics because it sort of shows the flexibility of the system. So Ben and Rob are going to give a shout out whenever we can be like, hey, if you use the Forest Stalker's potato cannon ability does cool things.
I don't know any of their names.
Right. Oh, and don't forget any opportunity we can to set Rob on fire.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
That's actually probably really easily doable now.
Hey, we can talk about that.
I think there's only one ability that actually sets you on fire at the
damn
moment.
it.
I assume we want to start with abilities instead of going straight into LAEs, or do we want to start just technical as we can? Anybody got opinions?
I don't have an opinion on that.
Let's talk about LAEs because it sets a lot of the groundwork of what our scripting is capable of. And so, first tell them what an LAE is, and then why it's awesome.
Yes,
and Rob's
yes,
going to take this
yes.
because it's mostly his brainchild.
Yes, this is my baby, or one of them. They're layered arithmetic expressions. They are one of the core pieces of how we do math on the server, well, as it specifically relates to the ability system. The general idea behind them is that order of operations is a giant pain, especially when you have a lot of different pieces mingling with each other. For example, with damage, there's let's pull a stat off of the weapon, let's apply any modifiers from the skill from each of its parts, which could be like 5 or 6 parts.
Yeah.
And then there's any buffs that we have on our character, which there's a few categories of, and then it goes over to the person who's being hit, and there's buffs and debuffs on them and armor on them, and we have to factor in deflection and armor penetration. There's basically a whole lot of things going on, and
That are all contributing to this mathematical equation.
Yes, and this is just all, how much damage did this do? And they all have to happen in a particular order, and you can imagine that if you had to manage this with parentheses, it just really would not work so well. So the idea behind the layered arithmetic expressions is that they're trying to simplify that process and make it so that no matter what order you put operations into them, when you evaluate it, it'll always come out the same number. So like if a buff got applied, or if buff A got applied, then buff B got applied, versus B got applied first, then A got applied, doesn't matter. They're in the same, they'll end up coming out to the same number. And the way that works is it's built out of layers, hence the layered part of it, that do arithmetic, hence the arithmetic part of it. And
the only thing that's ever named itself well.
Yeah.
And each layer is completely order of operations free. It's just we have a bunch of numbers that we add together for the additive part of it, and then we have a bunch of numbers that we add together for the multiplicative part of it. Then we multiply those two things together and apply some bounds to it. And then we have a bunch of these layers, which each the result of one gets piped into the next one, so that's how we get order of operations back in. So we would have something like on the initiator base layer, which is where we're starting, we pull the weapons value out of the weapons damage value, and then on the initiator's modifier layer we can pull in some buffs, and then on the subject armor layer we have apply the armor, and there could be buffs or debuffs to the armor even there that get applied within that layer, and then there's about a dozen layers in between those. So that's sort of the how they work. And one of the really neat things about these, at least in my opinion, is that it makes it so it reduces bugs a lot, because all of these components don't have to know about each other, and we can really easily add in something else that affects numbers, like the phases of the moon now affect damage, and it will be super simple on our part. Maybe we add a layer in, maybe we don't. We could just stick it on an existing one.
And consequently, Phases of the Moon is Rob and Marc sort of conspired together to get us a really powerful scripting engine for all of this, and we'll talk about that later. I want to break up some of the super technical with some ability stuff, but there's really, really cool stuff that we can do with scripts embedded in LAEs that are written by designers like Ben.
Yeah, so we can add something like that in at almost no cost to us, and it should, in theory, not have many bugs in it, and we don't have to wrangle order of operations when we're doing that.
And so Ben can set up things like, the damage from your weapon happens on one layer, all of your buffs and debuffs, like all of your, you could even have them tiered up, like all of your tier 1 buffs and debuffs happen on the next layer, all of your tier 2 buffs and debuffs happen on the layer after that, and then all of like system effects happen on the layer after that. And then we just reuse those layers in different places so that it's not super difficult to keep track of, which layer does this thing go on? And we just say, well, is it a tier 1 buff or a tier 2 buff? Is it a system level thing, or is it related to equipment? Yeah. And there's these very straightforward layers in terms of how things are layered for interactions.
Yeah, and I mean, even right now, we sort of have that with the, on the subject, the person who is being hit, we have a pre-armor damage and mitigation layer, and then we do the armor, and then we have a post-armor layer.
Yeah, and
So those all stack
there's
nicely.
a specific meaning to each of those, right?
Yeah.
Where the pre-armor, any kind of buffs or effects, like magic effects that are applied to your character, are before your armor happens. So those have, again, a bounds, right? So you can only have so much damage that is increased or reduced by those, no matter what the effects on your character are. And then there's armor, which comes after that, so the damage is already modified by that layer of buffs and debuffs before it gets to your armor. Then it gets to your armor, and we can even have buffs that specifically affect the effectiveness of your armor, and then it goes through your armor and actually gets to your character, where there's another layer that represents, the toughness of your character. If you're a Dvergr or a Golem or something that's very tough, you'll have another layer of things there that aren't affected by buffs and debuffs, that are just inherent to the character, that also affect the final incoming damage that's actually applied. So this gives us a lot of flexibility for our active effects, for when you can throw things at people, change what's their properties are, and modify the damage for one thing, but it works on everything. It's just a layered arithmetic expressions is not just a damage specific thing, it's a ability system specific thing.
It's almost every number in the ability system is backed by these.
Right.
Damage is just a good example because it's the one that uses it the most on a whole bunch of different layers. A bunch of them are just like, and we care about one layer and we're done.
And so, again, like an example of all of these things interacting could be, especially, we've started working on Banes and Boons very recently, though the system is basically going to just fall out of all of the ability work we've already done. But there's, for instance, a bane or a boon that says, you do 4% extra damage, and there's and I think it's probably a typed damage, like 4% extra slashing damage or something like that. And there's another one that might say, you do 10% less damage at night, and so we can just script in, like, if it's nighttime, add 10% damage, and then also add the 4% from this other thing, and then if your guy has a debuff to the amount of damage he's doing because he got hit by one of the stone healer's attacks that decreases your damage, but you also have a buff that increases your damage. All of those get evaluated on the proper layers in a predictable way so that people can min-max which buffs and stats they want to focus on and have consistent outcomes without having to worry about, okay, well, did I get hit with this buff first and this debuff second, unless of course like your buff your buff buffs other buffs or something crazy like that. But
and the lack of order, the ability to be order independent, as both these guys have said, is super important, and it gives the stability, and it's easier to find bugs and that kind of thing, and
not
track
only,
down where numbers are coming from. And
not only is it order independent, as Rob was saying with the multipliers, the way that those stack together, where they're additive instead of multiplicative against each other.
Right.
You don't have something that is 10% times 10% times 10% times 10%. You have 10 plus 10 plus 10, and those add together to
on one layer
on any given layer. And so we can control very carefully that there's nothing that gets insane as far as stacking multiplicative, which is a problem in a lot of systems.
And we can also per every layer set the bounds not only for the total value coming out of the layer, but for any multiplier on that layer. So it can be like, and on this layer, for example, with armor, the amount that armor reduces damage can be up to 75%. And that's super easy.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we've talked about some other games where you ran into issues of like your strength was a component of how much damage you do, and your skill proficiency was a component of how much damage you do, and then you figured out how much damage you were doing, and then you figured out how much tier 1 resist your opponent had, and then you figured out how much tier 2 resistance your opponent had, and you figured out how much armor it had, but it wasn't really clear whether or not your buff was a tier 1 buff or a tier, and so we just want to make all that stuff very clear, so that players can make intelligent decisions that best suits their play style and group needs and realm needs and all of that, and also so that we can look at a thing and say, okay, either this number is performing outside of the bounds of what we expected. Why is that? And go, okay, this layer came up with a higher product than we expected, and what contributed to that layer. And it becomes very easy for us to look at contributing factors in damages or buffs or debuffs or any number of things. Why did you get knocked back so far? Okay, it was because your weight was low and you had a debuff, and it becomes very easy for us to look at these equations, figure out the different layers that affected them, and which one went wacky. And
that's a nice, possibly, or a nice segue into the combat log, the debug combat log, which is another Rob thing, which which basically we print out all of these details of the multipliers, and you can...
there is actually an option that literally prints out the entire LAE every time one of them is evaluated, which is a bit excessive. It's not really useful outside of like one dude hitting another dude, because so much information comes out of one ability. But on the other hand,
that is the test that we do when we first implement an ability. Is okay, we put this ability together, it does all these complicated things. We're going to have this one character stand here and another character stand here and push the button and then see literally everything that happens.
And then even later on, it doesn't have to be when we're first making it. It's like, we know there's a problem with this ability. Well, let's turn on the heavy logging, and I mean, we're probably going to do the heavy logging regardless, but let's print out the heavy logging, and then we can see like basically every step of what happened in the ability.
And even we've started building this system in so that we can get good analytics out of it, with the potential to do something like, if we decide we want to go that way, we have support for, player A did damage to player B. Let's take an entire snapshot of player A's state and player B's state, to the point where, like, if player A has a buff from player C, we can look up the entire state of player C when player A damaged player B, so that we can just see the entire myriad of effects on there. That produces a lot of data, so we usually don't go that deep, but it's something that's available to us, and also just keeping an eye on how much data we generate, both in terms of bandwidth cost for sending it to the client and CPU cost for storing it out on the server and all of that. That's a balance we have to walk, but all of that information is available for us, which is a really, really powerful tool. Do we have anything else for LAEs?
I think we've covered the highlights.
Yeah, well, we can hit scripting a little bit. We can hit scripting a little bit more later.
Right.
There's more details to them, but
Right. And so that's a really sort of low-level system that we talked about it a little bit in the last stream, but it informs a lot of the way other things work. And so just got to rattle down this list of stuff that we've put in the last... When was the last time we did this stream? I don't remember.
The date of the last one?
Couple of months, 3 months.
Max knows.
Max will figure it out, but... But we, in terms of like buffs and debuffs, your basic stat buff,
It was 7/21/16.
So
I don't want to do
like
math.
2.5 months.
yeah, yeah, numbers are gross.
Yeah,
Not a
that's
huge
what
fan.
Rob's for.
No, I don't like numbers.
Rob hates numbers.
So in terms of buffs and debuffs, we've got like your normal like stat buffs plus 6 strength minus 7 dexterity.
We're not actually
not specifically
Yeah.
specifically those, but we have that system in place, and I don't know, maybe we'll let you talk about stats for a little bit, but not right now. But
we can talk about that if
um,
you would like at some point.
There's like three different like types of stats, right? Primary, secondary, and derived.
Yep.
Is there another main category of player stat?
Well, that's kind of been the ongoing debate of like, do those actually exist as a category of thing? Because we can buff and increase, or buff and debuff the like amount of damage that your character does, but is that a stat? No, it's not in the stat block anywhere.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just a property of the character that
Yeah,
you can modify.
that's why I was specifically trying to call out player stats like strength and dex and
Yeah.
vision and
The
and all.
three types, the primary
Yeah,
and secondary.
The
So-
primary and the secondary and the derived stats are the stats that you see on your character sheet. They're the stats that come from the primary and secondary stats.
Right.
Derived stats are just a result of those.
Yeah. So anyway, some of those, we have the system in place to debuff any of those, but I think in general we tend to stick to a smaller subset of those that Ben can talk about later. But we can buff and debuff those, and some of the byproducts of those, like your character's run speed, we can buff and debuff that to produce sprints and snares, and we were joking earlier because that also informs physics, which physics stats is its own thing, but like one of the physics stats is mass, so we could put a buff or debuff on you that made you weigh more or less, which would affect how much momentum you hit someone with when you ran into them, and how far you get knocked back, and how far you get thrown by different things, and all of that. So all of those we can buff and debuff. We can buff and debuff your damage and healing. And again, we'll talk about the scripting a little bit more later, but because I mentioned like there was a Bane earlier that we talked about, that like at nighttime you do 10% extra damage, or at the daytime you do 10% less damage. If you're like a nocturnal race, that's a Bane or a boon you can pick up. And so there's a teeny tiny little script in there that's just like, what time of day is it? Okay, you get the 10% or you don't. And that is one of the components that gets integrated into the LAEs when we're doing all these mathematical expressions. We've got timing stuff right now, so like your prep and recovery time, which is like your wind up time, and what people would sort of be used to is sort of like an animlock at the tail end of an an
Well, I don't want to even call it that, right? Because you're not animation locked.
right,
you can
right.
still move and everything. It's just like kind of the equivalent of having a global cooldown, but it's not
Because it's not global?
standardized, right? Yeah, and that's essentially what that means. It's the time, like, for example, it's the time between when you swing your sword, the time between when you hit someone, and the time when you start the next swing is the recovery time.
Right. And there was a thing we said there that I was going to say something about, and I lost it. It's gone. Oh, Animlock. We talked about this before, but specifically there are some games with like animation canceling and stuff like that where the animation drives your ability to use an ability. and that is a thing we are specifically avoiding in this game. If you're unfamiliar with what we're doing, but basically we say this ability takes X amount of time to prepare, X amount of time, Y amount of time to recover, and the animation follows that. The animation does not lead that.
Or it will do once we have the animations.
Well,
actually.
right. But that is to say, like, we don't dictate gameplay based on animations. We dictate animations based on gameplay.
Right. Yeah, and so all those timings exist right now, like in the ability system, in Hatchery, or in our internal development environment. All the timing exists, but the animations don't actually play because there's still some work there to do.
Yeah. And there can be multiple phases, and I think we probably talked about that last stream. Maybe we didn't. That's like all part of the skill component stuff. I don't know if we've talked about phases.
About
and
skill
stages.
phases?
But that's we'll
If
see
we have
how
time
long
later.
time we have for that. But there's we can have more than the prep and the recovery phase depending on the skill that you're using. We also have cooldown put in, but we don't have the ability to buff or debuff cooldown just yet. But that's like 30 minutes of a programmer's time. We can buff and debuff resistances to any number of elemental and physical types and all of that. Armor class and armor penetration, Rob just got in yesterday, and we can buff and debuff both of those. We also like costs, so like your mana costs, your blood costs. I don't know if we have health costs on
We
any
don't
of our
actually have
abilities.
mana. We have stamina
Sorry,
and blood.
stamina and blood. Yeah. My mouth went faster than my brain there. So stamina and blood costs you can buff and debuff, and if you had a health cost for whatever reason, you could buff and debuff that.
Do we have a class specific resource though that we put in?
I don't know that we've implemented any class-specific
Not
resources.
yet.
Yeah, maybe not yet. But we
I mean, there's
but
stuff
we
like
can do
that.
that.
Technically, it's possible on the states, but
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we could.
We're not gonna. Yeah. So those are all the different buffs and debuffs that we've gotten in terms of like physics features that we've got. Some of these are going to be like if I say projectiles, it sounds like a small number of things, but we're when we say projectiles, we mean like the back-end system that supports things like throwing stone healer stones at guys and shooting arrows and casting fireballs and throwing healer vials.
siege weapon
Right.
rocks.
Right, catapult rocks
In
and
fact-
ballista bolts.
And didn't we use projectiles for the orb?
yeah,
Yeah, we
I mean,
even
that-
use projectiles for an orb that just sits there because we set its gravity to 0
and its velocity is zero.
It's gravity
Yeah.
and velocity and tracking and everything is
Right,
zero,
right.
and it just appears there and just stays there in place, which is what it's
projectiles
supposed to be.
is it's more
it's more like entities that collide with things.
yes, and move in some fashion or don't.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple categories there with dynamics and kinematics, but most of them happen to have somewhat projectile motion, but it could be something that like follows a player around or like goes in circles or whatever, or
Yeah.
just
Yeah,
sits there.
there's
in
some
the
more
world.
logic in there we still need to expose. I think,
Sure, sure.
but-
Oh, we can do the follow players around.
Yeah.
Let's
We
see
also
about
have
How we do that in the script?
kinematics, which the line between projectiles and kinematics is at times a little bit vague, but generally kinematics are more for things like moving platforms and stationary objects that you want to sort of do some cool appearance effect and then just sort of stay where it's at until it's
Yeah.
I don't
done.
know. What is the
it's-
difference between a
it's-
kinematic and a projectile?
The dynamics, which are the projectiles among other things, are things that can be pushed around in the world and like will bounce off of things, assuming they don't explode when they hit, can bounce off of things and can be like blown by wind walls and otherwise affected. Where the kinematics, they have a rigid path in the world that they always follow. If there are other things in their path, they move those things out of the way. Like players. So if you make a kinematic that's a stone that comes up out of the ground and there's a player standing on top of it, it will lift the player
Right.
up.
So some of the things we've got like kinematics are our old earth wall that would just bring a wall up out of the ground. We've got the stone healer stones. Both of those had the ability and have the ability to be destroyed, right? We got stone healer stones.
they have health.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because they
They
drown
can be
for a little
destroyed.
bit.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
have
they
a health
actually
component.
drown
They
because
have a
they're
health
below the ground
component.
and they're
They still
below
do.
the water. They still do. I see.
I thought we had at least one other kinematic, but I can't think of off my head.
I
think
don't
there is
think
right
at the
now.
moment we do.
Okay, but it's a whole category of things like you could make walls and doors and like I said, the stone healer stones, probably the forest archer plants, the
Doors
forest
are
stalker
actually
plants.
kinematics.
Huh?
Doors are kinematics.
Are they? Okay.
The ballista is probably a kinematic, yeah.
The ballista is going to be a special flower.
Yeah. That'll probably
It'll probably be a
some sort of
kinematic.
hybrid.
But anyways, the forest stalker plants will be kinematics once we get them in.
Right.
Oh, that was the
Most
thing
likely.
that we didn't talk about.
Roots.
We're going through all the new features we put in. One of the main things I wanted to lead with that I spaced on was that since we basically have, I don't remember the exact language we said for this, we have all of our production ability parts, skill components, whatever we're calling them, in place for all of our beta 1 classes.
So there's
Except for the
still-
modifiers.
So, you're right. So there's still some modifiers that we need to put in. We have all the the functional parts, I would say, like the things that actually have various effects, like this deals damage, this does healing. The parts that we still have to put in are mostly like this increases your healing by 10%, but increases your blood cost by 10%. This, has a faster projectile speed, but then has a lower tracking strength, and things like that have some sort of statistical trade-offs that don't actually have many functional operations taking place. So they're fairly easy to implement. There's just a lot of them, and those are still in process being implemented.
And they also
But
give
the
you a
sy-
little bit of differentiation for your build. That's going to be a little bit of like your personal
Yeah,
flavor.
it's sort of more of the flavorful specialization sort of things, as opposed to like the root functionality that the class really relies
But, like,
upon, which
for-
are the things we've been testing much more heavily.
Yeah. For beta 1, outside of the modifiers, we basically have what we consider our beta 1 production skills in place for all 9 beta 1 classes.
Yeah.
And so that was supposed to be the preface to, hey, look at all the shit we can do now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know how many that is, Ben?
Um,
It's a lot. I've had to
No,
go through
there's-
them all.
There's
a
not a
lot.
good way to enumerate them right now because they're all
Yeah.
just separate XML files. But each one has on the order of,
There's probably 10 plus per class, right?
there are certainly more than 10 per class. There's something like 20, I think, per class if you count all the modifiers.
Right,
and all
right,
the
including
different
modifiers.
types.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So on the order of
no,
200.
there's not that many XML files yet because those don't exist.
Right.
A lot of the components are actually modifiers versus the number of core
Yeah.
components there are. So
there's probably
I would
like
say 20 each,
120.
9 classes.
There's probably like 120 to 150 done now, with like 200 to 250 by the time we're done.
Yeah, well, and some of that has some of the things that these guys were intended to have actually got cut in the course of development when it was like, no, we can't do this, we can't do this, let's change this to this. And now that we've gotten a much more ability functionality in, we can go back to that list if there's time here in the near future once all of the basic components are implemented, and once we get Banes and Boons and all these other things, we can maybe go back in and implement some of the other ones.
Right.
So even
Like
though
I think we did with one of the Stone Healer stones, where it was like this thing got cut while I was in the middle of working on it, and we're like, oh, well, sweet.
Oh, it actually works now. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so a bunch of the stuff we may end up actually adding more components than we are currently planning for because we have the functionality to do it now.
Yep.
And because it is far easier to just like take some of the templates we've set up for an ability part now and be like, okay, and fiddle with the numbers a little bit and add a feature to it, and boom.
Yeah, it's way easier to implement a component now than it was when we first started the system.
Right.
Part of that is that the XML is getting better, like the formatting, the technical side of it is getting better, and part of it is just because we are building up such a library of things. It's much easier to look through the list of things we've already made and be like, this one does pretty close to what I want to do. I'm going to copy that and then swap in a couple other nodes and have something that's completely different.
And I'd like to call out with our development, and development almost always goes like this, but at first, we had nothing for like months, and then all of a sudden, we got a couple of things, and then 10 things, and then 100 things, and so developments become very exponential. Rob just added, we technically had the ability to script it, but he added what was the one you did?
Group
Well, there was
for armor pen.
the ability armor penetration group, the ability to just say, give me all your group members and do this to it, like that. As soon as groups went in, that was
It was something we could, like Rob said, it was something we could do as soon as groups went in, but he
Via
spent
scripting.
Like 15 minutes and made it way easier for Ben to do it.
Yeah, because we wanted to do it as
it's
a
little
filter.
piece of code instead of like a few lines of code.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In the XML.
It was a much more useful few lines too, because it was actually filtering based on like the area of effect, filter by group, or instead of having to do a group and then do
you
an
can do
area
it either way.
separately. Yeah.
And but similarly, when some of these new things come online, they interact, and this was the whole point of how we built the system, how we prototyped it. They interact in mostly well behaved interesting ways with everything we have already. So it's kind of cool to watch things come online, and then all of a sudden this whole doorway of stuff opens up with this one little thing. So.
Well, and you could see it like when we were working internally, like Rob spent a lot of time doing what we called vinification, which was taking prototypes that were done by engineers for engineers and converting them more to something that was usable or specifically user friendly for a designer. And so it was when we first prototyped the system, it would take Ben, a couple of days to sort of wrap his head around all the things he wanted to do to make one component. And 2 weeks ago, Rob and Ben just spent a week and put in 50 parts or something like that.
Yeah.
And we went from 2 or 3 days per part to 50 parts in a week. And it was less time than that, I think, but...
Yeah, and there's other things going on as well, so it's not just purely working on that one thing. But.
Exactly. So it's we're in a good spot in production. It's in full production.
So yeah, all of that was... We've got the vast majority of the gameplay mechanics that your classes are going to be doing are basically in, minus some of the modifiers like we talked about. And
those aren't the mechanics; those are actual components.
Right,
There's some mechanics I think you've got here in a list,
we'll
still
talk
on a
about them
to-do
later.
list.
Did I have? Yeah, those are back.
Yep.
There's always a to-do list.
Right. Yeah.
There's always ability systems are never finished. They're
if the game
always
was
a
ready
work in
for beta
progress.
right now, we'd be in beta right now.
Well, no, but even beyond beta, beyond forever, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be a feature list of hey, I wish we could do this in the ability system.
Yeah.
And that's just a feature list that will continue growing indefinitely. So there's never a done point where it's okay, the ability system is now finished. There's always going to be ongoing development as far as the abilities are concerned.
Right. Yeah. So all that to get back to cool shit that we can do. We were talking about kinematics. Let me see if I can read my own handwriting. Oh, triggers. So we can. We were joking about it, but there's triggers where you can run into an area and get a buff or debuff, and I think we used them for clouds and healing wells and stuff before.
Oh.
But we've got the ability to attach them to arbitrary things and hook up random data-driven skill nodes that Rob used to give us stuff like drowning, so that if you go off the ocean at the end of the world, there's a trigger that gives us drowning, and basically we already had the system in place, and so it was pretty easy for us to get that in, minus some very specific bugs when things that shouldn't be able to drown started drowning.
Oh no, that still happens.
I think
still
that
happens.
That's not a bug. That's a bonus.
This is
when your stone healer stones
Yeah,
drown.
exactly.
This is just things interacting in cool new ways. Emergent gameplay.
And we were talking. We've been working on doing a lot of planning the last couple of days, and places of power, which are something you guys might have seen if you were in some of the earlier alpha tests. Is okay, we can just strap a trigger in the place of power and hook up a place of power buff to it, and then Ben can do whatever the hell he wants in that buff or debuff.
Yeah.
Not even buff or debuff, but just a
just a
block
skill node.
block of skill node. Yeah,
It does a thing.
Literally anything the skill system can do can be done in a trigger volume for a place of power.
Right. Yeah.
Or going into the water or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Not to be confused with triggers that are triggers within the ability system.
Right.
As opposed to trigger volumes, which are a physics thing.
What was the other thing that was?
Conceptually pretty simple.
Similar to that, we recently, well, not recently, a while back, we got wounds in, but we got traumas in a couple of days ago, right?
Yep.
And basically traumas were,
Yeah, it was yesterday.
for those that don't know, a wound is sort of a health reservation. Your health bar is sort of chopped up, and when you hit certain thresholds, that chunk of health gets reserved until the wound gets cured. And also you get a trauma, which is generally a temporary debuff on your character to just sort of add extra gravity to that wound. And so we just hooked up skill nodes to those particular events, and Ben can do whatever the hell he wants in there.
That's what traumas are.
Yeah. And so, in general, it's if your
insane.
leg gets a trauma, we might put a speed debuff on you, and if your head gets a trauma, we might put a cooldown debuff on you. But Ben could really the sky is the limit there. He could make it so that if your leg gets a trauma, we knock you into orbit. That's a thing we could do if we wanted to.
Or we light Rob on fire.
Or we light
As-
Rob on
as-
fire. Yeah. Every time any player gets a trauma to their leg, we light Rob on fire.
That is a thing we can do. we have talked about
And
it
it'll do
before.
10% extra
we can
damage if it's
actually
nighttime.
do it now. We should actually probably just implement it that
Yeah.
like,
I see.
today or tomorrow.
Yeah. We'll just again, like we'll do some benefication. So light Rob on fire is just a skill.
Yeah, it's just a script.
What else do we have? Knockback, teleport. Teleport's pretty cool. We've got the Stone Healer Stone. I never get the name right. Terrestrial Transference.
Yes.
Um,
Damn boy.
which swaps the position of you and your stone, and so it just teleports you to each other's location. Oh, right, physics stats, which we talked about earlier, so you can like buff and debuff your speed and mass and turning and acceleration, and I don't know if there's any other physics stats that
Probably
off the top of my head. So that's all the buffs and debuffs and physicsy things. Is there any other you want to talk about scripting, since we just went through a bunch of I guess Mark can talk about scripting.
Yeah, that's his project.
Yeah,
Mark and
so
Ben, because Ben's the one actually doing the scripting.
yeah, well, and Rob made it nice. All I did was build the core system. So we early on we made it so C#.
Many moons ago.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
C# allows they basically ship their compiler with your app, and so you can actually compile arbitrary C# to run while your program's running. So early on, we decided to use that to make every value in the scripting or in the ability system, skill system, a little C# script, right?
Yes, can
Yeah,
be.
yeah. Literally every single one can be, and so it's hundreds of them.
Way more than that now.
Yeah, you're
It's
right.
like hundreds
It's-
per player.
Yeah, it's many, and so, but it's really cool because we basically dynamically build these little tiny scripts and then compile them, and then once they're compiled, they're really fast. So instead in a lot of systems, you'll build internal structures that kind of represent the math. Here, it's just C# script that compiles and then goes through their JIT compiler to make it really, really fast at native speed. And so Ben.
Exactly once.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly once per field,
Right.
and it's pretty quick and what have you, sort of. And so Ben can then, that means he can literally say, like, put completely arbitrary C# script in literally any value, any spot where we pull a value out.
Right.
He can, and so things like at first how we got values from the weapons was a hard coded in the engine set of code, and then we moved that to being script that just does it in a script spot.
And so Ben can do stuff like, how much damage does this attack do? And so there's a little script that's like, look up, the damage for the slashing damage component of this weapon, use that damage, multiply it by 0.7 because reasons, and add in all these other factors, how much health you're missing, and all of that is a little script for how much damage does this thing do.
Yeah.
And the impetus for that was that in the older system, basically anytime we wanted to do anything interesting, it was a custom code, and it would go through this full path, and 2 weeks later show up. Now it's literally, if he wants to add something, it's plus something.
Yeah.
It's not put a request into engineering, wait 3 days, get plus something. It's just plus something.
Yeah,
So
before I think we did something like damage from max health.
Right,
And
right.
we did it as like an actual function that
Yeah.
was like, if you wanted to do this,
It
you
was
did
a
do the damage
class.
function, you did the damage from max health
class, yeah,
or whatever it was, and then it would only do that. And so you couldn't say, well, I want, plus 10% of the damage from your max health. It was just literal. And so there's very little functionality there, whereas now you can basically take any call to any function that we have variables accessible from in C# and
Yep.
insert it there into some place that was supposed to just take a number.
And we were joking earlier because, like, if there's a field that's like, how much healing does this ability do? Like, if Ben wanted to, he could be like, well, in the script, hold that thought, set Rob on fire, and then return 12. That's how much it heals for.
Right.
That is a thing that is possible.
or like more importantly, like return how much on fire Rob was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Rob might have fire resistance, and then resultantly, based on how much on fire he was, feed that back into something else. So we can pull things from all over the place, and that gives us the ability to make some more interesting functionality in the ability system much more easily than we could previously.
So to make our light Rob on fire node, the only thing we're actually missing is look up the subject from account ID.
Right.
Yeah, you'd have to be able to somehow reference their entity ID from their account.
So that's probably actually like a 20-minute task
Right.
into the game.
And the important thing is, thanks to
Oh
thanks,
God!
thanks to
No, I was looking at the time.
Oh,
We're like
yeah.
a third of the way through my sheet and 40 minutes through our hour stream.
yes.
Just read it faster.
The cool thing is, since it's all compiled down, it is significantly faster than if it was scripted in the 20 other different ways you could do it. So
I had actually made an optimization, so like we could put in a script or we could just do a hard value, and it turns out they're basically the same speed at this point.
yep.
Yeah, we were concerned about, do we really want to make all of these things scripts? And apparently, yes, we do, because it doesn't
It's
matter.
fine.
Yeah. We started out with like, okay, you can script how much damage you do, and you can script how much healing you do,
But-
and then we were like, well, we kind of.
Oh, God.
I don't know where this is going, but I like it.
We'll see at the end.
All right.
And then it was like, well, we need to script what damage type you're doing, and we need to script who you're hitting, and so we just sort of moved to the point where it's like everything is scriptable, and if that script is, for how much damage do you want to do, if that script is 1,000, if you've got an ability that's called do 1,000 damage, Ben can just put 1,000 in there. But if you've got an ability that does, the month, the number of the month times how many bad guys are nearby times 0.7, so that you do 70% of that times your weapon damage minus how many wounds you've got. That's a thing we can do, and Rob has even built in shorthand so that Ben can do it pretty concisely.
Yeah. There's specifically we have.
Do you want to try and explain expressions and definitions?
No.
Well, because I think that'll be funny.
just the,
I still don't know it.
Oh.
the high level overview of this is Ben can access any code. So like literally as soon as the feature goes in, Ben can use it. Like groups, the second it hit the master branch, Ben could technically use it. Then I took like 10 minutes later on to write a little helper function just so it's like, again, instead of a whole bunch of lines of code, just a few lines of code. But then even past that, for manipulating the LAEs, I made a shorthand syntax for that.
What is that called?
I don't have a name for the syntax.
I called it C-flat.
Yeah. That's just something I just made up that just like turns a string and expands it into a script. So those are super concise. And those can have scripts inside of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's burn through some of my list real quick.
To make sure we get
I mean,
through
we've
those.
talked about a lot of the cool stuff, but I also want to keep people sort of updated on where we're at.
Yeah.
So we've got periodic so that we can say, every interval do thing, and thing is any random ass thing that Ben can do. So
This is from damage over time to
Right.
anything that happens every so often.
every 1 second knock Donnie T into the orbit, or
Yep.
every 5 seconds light Rob on fire, or whatever. Anything we can do at an interval. I have resources, so we've got stamina and blood, and they're
Yep.
they're buffable and debuffable, and your costs are buffable and debuffable, and when you run out of blood you die, and you can regen and degen, and the whole 9 yards are there. I've got health in here, and I don't actually know what the hell that means.
Things have health.
Things
Yeah,
have health.
things have health. I guess we
Well, we have a
recently,
health component.
we added the ability for things like the Stone Healer stones to have health and resultantly die, because I was like, hey, we need the ability for these things to have health, and so we added health to them, and their health hit 0, and they were like, well, my health is 0 now, and they didn't die.
And even more than that, also, we added the ability for arbitrary skills to add components,
Right, yes.
one of which is a health component, to arbitrary entities, so they can just tack them on.
Yeah, so we can do stuff like we do right now with the Stone Healer stones, where you throw a stone, and then that stone hits something, be it the ground or a player or another stone or whatever, and drops a deployed stone on the ground. And so the first stone was a projectile, the second stone is a kinematic, and it rises up out of the ground, and it has a health bar so that you can kill it.
Yep.
It should actually be targetable with the client skills branch, yeah?
I'm not sure if it's targetable or not, but it should be. That's one of the
It has
things we
health,
can
it
look at.
dies.
Yeah.
You just can't
Yeah.
target it
But I know
properly
you can like
because of
kill
the
it with
client.
cleaves and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
AoE.
Yep.
But
Except for the one
and
that
so
kills
the funny thing we were talking about with drowning earlier is one of our test levels is basically barely above sea level, and it starts out in the ground a little bit and comes up, and since it starts out under the
So
ground,
they would all
it's technically
die.
submerged, and so it starts drowning and comes up out of the ground, which is fantastic.
So by the time it gets up, it's at like half health.
Yeah. Unfortunately, almost all the stone healer stones are like heals and shields, so it just heals itself back up like a boss. We had the triggers we talked about earlier. 2 different types of triggers. We've got like trigger this buff or trigger this event on my character when qualifying event happens. Like I think the Mjolnir does a bunch of that stuff where like put a debuff on a dude and the next time I hit him trigger a damage payload on him and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's only when you actually execute specific abilities that deploy that charge. So you can charge up your weapon and then wait for the opportune time to expend that charge, but then you would have to charge your weapon back up, which is a spell, and you don't want to be casting a spell while you're being attacked because it has low stability. So you have to be very careful about when you use that charge because you're probably not going to get another chance to use it unless you disengage.
Right. We've got conditionals, so we can say stuff like if you do armor penetration, which is also another system that we got in recently. Armor penetration is basically like I want to do piercing damage against this guy, but my armor penetration isn't higher than his armor class, and so instead I do crushing, bashing, smashing,
Crushing
damage.
Yep.
Crushing, mashing.
Whacking.
Mashing damage.
And so, but then we can say, okay, did you do armor penetration? If so, cause bleeding or cause poison or whatever. So that's so we've got conditionals that can do stuff like that. We've got requirements, so you can only use this skill if you have a sword equipped, or you can only use this skill if you have 20 stamina, or you can only use this skill if it's winter. We've got spatial queries, so we can say grab everybody in a cube around you, grab everyone in a cone around you, grab everyone in a sphere around you.
Or around something else.
Yeah, or around something else.
Around a stone that has an aura that
exactly.
heals people.
The whole stone healer thing again is it's crazy because it's throw a projectile that creates a kinematic that puts health on itself and then puts a buff on itself that does a AOE query that heals everybody in the AOE.
And periodically.
Periodically runs a skill node which says to heal everybody around it.
Yes. And this is why the ability system took a little while to kind of figure out and make sure it works.
We've got group stuff in which we've talked about a bunch. We've got filters so that we can say like grab everybody around me and heal the friends and damage the enemies and like we were talking about with groups. Originally, I think Ben was trying to do like query for everybody around me and then pare it down to group members, and we decided it was more optimal to say get all of my group members and then filter by people that are close to me. We hooked all of our stats up to weapons, so your weapons prep time, your weapons recovery time, your weapons primary damage type, your weapons fallback damage type, which is if you don't armor pen, the damage values for both of those. We recently got stat requirements in, so that you have to have 20 strength and 30 dex to equip this weapon. What are some other interesting weapon stats?
I forget the whole list. There's the timings, the
It's
damages.
mostly timings and damage.
Deflection.
That's
Deflection.
true. Deflection
which
just started.
is another system we got in place, which is basically periodically each weapon and or shield, because shields are basically weapons. Each weapon and or shield has a periodic chance to deflect an attack.
It's not even a chance.
Right. You're right.
limited.
Not a chance. It's every 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever the deflection timer for that weapon is.
Yep.
You have a chance to. This is the one part that's not complete yet, which is it reduces the power of an attack. We don't quite have that in right now. It reduces the damage of an attack, and I don't want to talk about power right now, so we'll do that in another stream. And so deflection is basically and buffing and debuffing. The timings for deflection and the amounts for deflection are in. So that's all the weapon stats. We talked about wounds and traumas. Those are in. We talked about scripting with the conditionals. We've got a little bit of a state machine in there in case you want to use it for very specific things. Again, don't want to go too deep into that because it's not very fancy and it's not very clever, and we like talking about fancy, clever things.
But it does about anything you want it
It does
to.
just about anything you want it to do. We talked a little bit about coefficients, where Ben can say, like, do 70% of your weapon damage with this attack and 85% of your weapon damage with this attack, and it's super trivial for him to change all of that. we've got most of our entity component model available to our ability system, so Ben could hypothetically, if you wanted to, say, shoot a projectile and give that projectile health and give that projectile faction and put that projectile into your group and
Give it an inventory.
yeah, give it an inventory.
Yeah.
I don't think this is a good idea.
I think it's a great idea now.
Never said it was a good idea, but it's possible.
And can't read my handwriting there, so we're going to skip that one.
That
we
was the
talked
most
about
important one.
Now I
so
wanna know.
support
Damn
through
it.
something. No idea. Anyways, support through abilities. That's what that was. Combat logging we got in. Debug combat logging, which is more advanced combat logging. Descriptions we got in, which are a little bit rough right now, but
They're horrible. I need to. They
just
were,
need
all the
those
cool
back.
timing stuff, prep time, recovery time, cooldowns.
Oh,
Skill.
I wanted to comment on some of that stuff. The idea of what an ability costs is not baked in any way, shape, or form. It just happens to be at the beginning of the ability. Fire off this skill node to like debit this and check for that and and so it's in a lot of systems you'll have like a cost node and sometimes only certain things can go in there and all that kind of stuff. In this, like literally, like it's completely arbitrary.
Yeah, as
Target
part-
self
yeah.
and does things.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
exactly.
It literally is just target myself and subtract value, like you said. And so
A large
That's
part
pretty
of the backing code of the ability system has no idea what sort of things are actually being implemented.
Exactly,
Like
yeah.
the whole concept of a stone healer stone is not something in code.
Right.
I think like we have the stone types
The type,
enumerated
yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah,
but
that's
it.
the only like stone healer specific code.
And-
is like what type of stone do you have?
and another
And that's
interesting.
only because it has to be enumerated somewhere because you can only have one of each type
Right.
at a
Yeah,
time.
yeah. But I mean, we could probably even do that with tags.
Yeah.
Probably.
With
And
tags
another
possible.
interesting thing was like Rob just did armor penetration, and the system doesn't know about armor penetration. That's purely built
Yeah, that's just XML.
in the XML in the ability system. Like there's just nothing there about armor penetration in the engine at all. So that's
It's just some conditionals and some scripts.
Yeah,
and
the
some
items have the
numbers.
stats, and then there's
Yep.
some
That's
XML
great.
that checks the stats and does things.
Yep.
So we got skill tracks in, which is slightly complex. Basically, we wanted the ability for you to be able to do different skills at the same time based on criteria. And so Andrew does this fantastic animation where he waves his head around in his arms and stuff. And the premise there is that you can be doing a right-handed attack, you can be doing a left-handed attack, you can be singing a song because you're a skald or a bard or a minstrel or whatever, which which uses your voice track. I think jokingly we might even have a mind track in there, so you could be shooting mind bullets while singing and swinging your swords around. That's telekinesis, Kyle. So we've got like support for skill tracks, and recently started pushing that to the client so that we can actually render it properly.
Yes.
That's a detail.
But the whole skill track thing is
the
really, really
server.
cool. And so you can do stuff where, like, if you wanted to swing your sword and shield bash at the same time, as long as they're on distinct tracks, that's a thing you could do. But if you wanted, maybe there was a punch attack that doesn't use your weapon and you're wielding a two-hander, you could punch with your left hand and still leave your right hand open or whatever. But if you're using a two-handed attack, that blocks up both your left hand and your right hand so that you can't do anything with either of them. So there's a whole system there that allows you to more discreetly control your hands, though it's not, you don't get to choose the hand, the hand is implicit in the parts you use, but
Getting a little philosophical there, aren't you? The hand chooses you.
the hand is the LAEs we talked about. We've started working on getting bounds in there so that we can say that, like, you can't buff your movement speed below 0% and
Yeah.
make it go negative. You can't make your damage go below 0, so it goes negative and in turn heals you. And
in particular, global bounds that
Global
apply
bounds.
to
There's local
everything.
bounds.
Right, yeah.
Or-
Because we can already bound things.
Yeah.
We talked about Roslyn. We talked about C-flat / the text parser a little bit. We've got disruption in there, which interrupts your, it interrupts. It's disruption and stability. You can buff and debuff those. Disruption and stability come in from your weapon stats. We recently got, is this thing interrupted by movement?
Yep.
I'm not sure do we have a coefficient for that? How much
Yes.
per feet do you get interrupted, and is that
Nope,
available to
our
Ben?
game is in
Yes.
meters.
Yes, it's meters.
Furlongs.
Yes, that is available to Ben.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's in DB bars. I know,
I mean,
right?
that's
We'll probably move it at some point.
Oh, that's
Not
good.
specifically ability system related, but we've got resource nodes in. Are they in or really close to in? I don't remember.
Really close to
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
say,
yeah. So you can run around and start gathering resources and stuff like that. Talked about drowning, talked about deflection. We're going to skip that random gameplay stuff that was filler in case we didn't make it and talk a little bit about where we're going.
Okay, yeah. So that's all the stuff that we have that's working more or
Yep.
less right now. There's some
a couple
optimizations and additional features and stuff that will go with it, but that's stuff that's all more or less been worked on and tried out a little bit, and it's work in progress.
We've got Banes and Boons coming soon-ish, which is part of your character creation where you can pick benefits and penalties to your character and they balance out. And that system should be really, really easy for us to put in because it just falls out of all the skill nodes, like all the triggers and other stuff we're doing. So it's a really familiar thing that Ben has to
Specifically, it's
do.
the
and-
ability to have a effect that is omnipresent on your character, that is there all the time, that is not applied by any ability
Exactly.
or anything.
Yep. Some of the nitty gritty of archery we still have to work out, specifically like the animations and timing and stages for knocking an arrow and drawing an arrow and firing it. And there's some of those particular pieces are missing, though we've approximated them in our current implementation of
Well,
our skills, right?
No, we haven't even approximated them. What we've done is we've implemented the components that they will use. You just can't execute them separately. So right now you're executing all of the components together in a single ability,
Right.
which is the thing you'll still eventually be able to do if you want a one-button press archery ability. But eventually you'll be able to break that up into separate ones so that if you wanted to draw your bow and just wait and then hit another ability button to actually loose the arrow, that's something that will come out of the additional archery features.
Right.
We need to get proper stacking in. We've got a little bit of like stacking limitation right now, but we need to get proper stacking in so that Ben can say stuff like you can only be burning 5 times, and so if you've got burning,
But
and you
if
get,
Rob 10.
right, if you've got burning and you get another burning, it just adds 2 burnings up till 5, or it adds 1 burning for a total of 2 up to 5. But if you've got a speed debuff and you get a new speed debuff instead, that just adds the time to the debuff. And if you've got a cooldown debuff, it just refreshes the timer on the cooldown debuff, and getting rules like that into place so that Ben can control exactly how new buffs interact with existing buffs.
Yeah, there's some additional details of stacking groups and
Right. Yep.
stuff that we'll have to work out there.
We still have stances coming, which is stuff like I want to be in an offensive stance and do more damage, or a defensive stance and take less damage.
Which
and-
theoretically is something we can almost entirely do through XML. There's going to be some UI things there. I think.
Yeah,
We're gonna
exactly.
have to
There's a
customize.
bunch of things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
that-
yeah. We could cheat those in, but we want to codify them a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, like I've started working on some of the things that could be code or could be XML. Armor Pen was one. It turns out that can just be XML.
Yeah.
We don't even need code.
And so it's always questionable of like, how should we implement this? Because now we have choices.
Siege engines, which are going to be really, really cool, because that's going to be one of the big problems we had with the old system was it was mostly designed so that players were the only thing that could use skills. And we want our siege engines to be able to have their own skill set that they use and their own skill tracks. And so, like, if we wanted to go crazy, you could have, a swing arm skill track and a crank skill track and a munition hopper skill track and have, like, 3 guys working on each of those or whatever. So we could do really, really cool stuff with that. But this is the first time we've gotten to use the new system on a thing that isn't a player, which was one of the reasons we designed it, and so we're finally getting to that, which is really, really cool. The whole progression system, I want to use a skill, and I think for Beta 1, because I don't want to overpromise here, for Beta 1, progression is exclusively for unlocking new parts, right?
Well, I would like to see it go for stats so that you can increase your strength.
Okay.
And then the unlocking of new parts
Right.
can be based on that.
Right.
Would be eventually we're going to have it so that you can actually increase the proficiency of any given parts and have its stats improve. But that's a further thing that's a lot
And
harder
so, like,
to-
your sword component will eventually mature and become more effective the more you use it.
Yeah.
For
That's
beta,
in the future.
right? That's why I said eventually. But for Beta 1 specifically, your stats may or may not progress, and you will unlock new parts as you use your older parts
Yeah.
more and more.
I would like to be able to rely on stats primarily to do that, because I think that's probably
Right.
pretty easy to say.
So
Your strength
right.
goes up.
We're going to be building out that system with the short-term goal of Beta 1, but the long-term goal of being able to support some more of this stuff that we're talking about. getting all the VFX and animations and sound effects hooked up so that combat is actually visceral and not your dude just standing there doing an awkward animation.
And we're not looking at the debug,
Yeah.
the debug output going, yeah, this is a lot of fun.
I don't know. That's fun for me.
Well, yeah.
But you hated math. Or is
No,
text okay?
I hate numbers.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. Like math.
Math is great.
You like doing math with letters?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the best kind of math.
And yes, encumbrance. So making it so that equipping gear, picking items up, all of that affects how much your character can carry, and that in turn affects your movement speed. Is
Well,
the
so
primary
there's
thing
carrying
of-
capacity, right? Of like you can only carry so much stuff, and then that contributes to your encumbrance. But also just wearing armor contributes to your encumbrance. So if you're wearing heavy armor, your encumbrance goes up, even though you may not care how heavy it is because your character has a lot of strength.
Right.
You're still going to slow
Awkward.
down because it's it's awkward because it's big and bulky, and so heavy armor characters are going to attack slower and move slower than
like
light armor
carrying a
characters,
couch.
regardless of the weight, pretty much.
Right. And Max just waved the clock at me because it's 4 o'clock, and that was the last item on my list.
I see. So we got
So-
through all of the items and no
Hooray.
questions. Is that
Yeah.
the way
Well,
it's
no,
gonna be?
we said we were going to do an hour and then
And then an hour
20
of
or 20 or
questions?
30 minutes of
20
Q&A.
minutes of questions?
All right.
Unless, is there
So
anything
it's up
else
to
you guys
questions.
want to hit on real quick?
I'll let other people.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
wanna ask-
Mark's been super quiet, so I was sort of hoping he'd actually talk, but
I talked about scripts.
okay.
That was your thing.
All right,
That's
so
all Mark
let's
does here,
open it up for
scripts.
Q&A.
All right, folks. So go ahead and hit this crew with your questions. Please keep it focused on topic. This is about the ability system and stuff related to that. Don't just ask about features and whatnot,
Unless they're ability system
unless
features.
they're ability system features.
I don't think they'll have a problem
Um,
finding some
yeah.
ability system
Yeah, if we
questions.
run over, we've got some other stuff we can talk about, but we won't run over, so it's fine.
Yeah.
All right. Sagrix asks, with all the
Sorry.
abilities,
Everyone laughs.
Well, I was like, of course he's first.
with all the abilities worked on for Beta 1, are the animations ready to be connected?
Clan skills branch, go.
Right. So there's 3 parts to that question. One is the ability system being ready, which to the best of our knowledge, because we haven't hooked up the animations yet, so I can't tell you for certain that they work, but to the best of our knowledge, the server side and the way that we communicate abilities to the client are ready to start being hooked up to the animations. I would have to ask Scott and Tyler if all of our animations are ready, but I believe most of our animations are ready for most of our anim sets, which are sort of specific to what weapon you're having. So like you've got a specific set of animations that you do with a greatsword, a specific set of animations that you do with a flail and an axe and a
Which
sword.
is a limited set of
Yeah.
placeholder get us into
Right.
play.
So I believe most of the animations are ready to go for that. So the next step, which was part of what I called out with the VFX thing, is gluing those together, and that's a very high priority, something that we're hoping is coming very, very soon, but we still have to do a little bit more planning on that. So that is coming. That is the next step, the next major step for rehabilitation,
Yeah,
and probably the most important step.
I know
coming up.
Mike is working on some shiny new spell effects,
Right.
and DB is working on some more
Yeah,
sounds and
we've
stuff.
got sound
and then
effects
there's
coming, we've
glue
got
to glue
anim-
those into the actual game.
And so we're missing the clue, but it's glue, but it's one of our top priorities.
Odilvik asks, can you crush a player against a roof if you summon a stone beneath them, doing damage to the player?
I like how everybody looked at Rob.
I will get that in at some point.
All right.
I think I need to put the event back in for impact
Yeah, we lost
damage.
shock damage, I think.
Yeah. Shock being the physics term for
Mark should help me
sudden
remember to add that
change
to
in
the biggest
velocity.
list.
Right.
Yeah, I'm totally.
Yeah, I could
Hang on,
probably
we're
do
having
that this
some,
afternoon or something.
We're having some kind of technical issue.
You're a technical.
What?
Technical issue.
What is the technical issue?
Do I need to pull out my phone?
I don't know. It seems like the internet just decided to stop sending the stream
Nice.
Out or in or both?
out.
No. Oh, wait, nobody
Yes.
can see this.
Okay, we should be back now.
Are we back?
Are we back?
Hello.
Twitch chat? Are we okay?
Okay. All right, I think we're back. Yeah.
Say I can't hear you if you can hear us.
Yeah.
Wait, what? Okay, hopefully, I think we're back now. Yes. Okay, working. All right.
Yay.
Just Twitch messing with my head again.
All right, good.
I don't know why it randomly did that. Okay.
So I don't think we've got shock damage for pinching yet, right? Like mostly damage
No.
happens if something
Compression damage.
slams into you
we
really
don't, we
hard.
don't have
or-
crushing.
Right.
We have your
But we do
velocity.
in the
need
ability
we need
system.
smushing damage.
We have well with very little effort because I just haven't hooked up the event for it. But we'll have your velocity changed very quickly.
Right.
Damage.
Yes, because that's how it works.
Though we might potentially, no promises here. Once we figure out exactly what we want to do with rubble, there may be some gameplay impact of rubble, like it does damage when it falls on you. Might.
Oh, yeah.
no
Would
promises.
just, that would just fall out of heavy thing hits you.
Yeah,
Fallout.
All right.
because they're
Agony.
rocks and they
Go
fall.
ahead.
Yeah.
Really?
Agony asks, is there no significant performance hit having so much JIT with the scripts?
Not really.
Why not?
It's all.
Could you elaborate?
No. There's obviously first time hits, but so far it's just been completely unnoticeable. So it hasn't been an issue
So
at all.
right now we're doing, mostly so that we can start our servers up very quickly for iteration, we're doing lazy compilation of the scripts. So generally the first time a character logs in with a given part, it takes a little bit of time to compile them, but after that it's as good as, almost as good as, if not as good as bare C#.
Yeah, as if we compiled it into the.
Yeah.
Which is something we can do later. Is just flat out build all these separately, save them off into files, and compile them. I could actually just literally do that. So we have
we will definitely want a config setting for that, so we can do that for production, so
Precisely.
that players
Yeah.
don't experience
Oh,
this.
and we've
but
talked
we
about
don't want to
stuff-
do it for internal because that would make our servers spin up very slow, and we spin up servers all the time.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
and our editor, we talked about, like right now Ben's editor is basically Notepad.
Yeah.
If we have an actual editor, like the editor could have a build step of like compile the script, emit
Compile
the
errors in
IL,
scripts
and
would be
push it to the
amazing.
database.
Yep, absolutely.
Zeromus asks, is the ability system being designed in a way that if you wanted to add something like naval combat in an expansion, it would be easy to do, at least the abilities related to it?
Well, naval combat has a lot of implications, right? So there's being able to
Well,
traverse water
right.
on vehicles and
The-
have moving platforms that traverse space.
I mean,
The system is being
that part of
built
it, but-
as an extensible engine that we could do a myriad of games, expansions, and prototypes for things with.
For example, the siege engine we're doing, like that's not a lot different than a cannon, or and so some of that stuff, and
Well, I
then
think
the kinematics.
The question was like for this game specifically, if we're going to
absolutely.
add Viking ships and stuff.
right,
I mean, that's
Probably
just a
not
matter,
cannons, but
yeah,
That's
Magical
just a matter
cannons.
of
Magic
making
cannons?
boats.
Right, exactly.
Because,
Like
the rest of it will just work.
Right,
Right.
like buoyancy and boats are the hard part, but in terms of like I want to use a skill to steer the boat or I want to use a skill to fire the cannon, like the system is being built with that
Yeah,
sort of
like-
flexibility in mind.
like you were just talking about
Definitely.
the siege engine, if you wanted to multi-crew a ship and
Yeah.
have this guy is working the sails part of the ship, this guy is working the steering part of the ship, that's a thing that we can do.
And that's also why I called out the fact that a lot of the stuff we built in the ability system, the core code knows nothing about, which implies that we can do something, do more stuff like that, where it's like, oh, this is completely doable in our XML and our scripts. We don't even have to touch the engine. And so, yes, definitely it is definitely being written very, 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 very deliberately for that reason.
It's stupidly flexible.
Yeah,
Like, it's crazy.
yeah, it's super
Cleverly flexible.
Mihuge asks, how will diminishing returns work with the new system?
So there's no diminishing returns implicitly built into the system. A lot of the question of how to deal with the stacking of effects is more to do with the effects being able to be applied and removed in ways that promote counterplay. So what we don't want to have is, say, a 15-second, 75% movement speed reduction that basically costs nothing and has no cooldown, and so you can basically slow someone by 75% permanently, and then they never get out of it because there's no implicit diminishing returns or method of reducing that effect over time. So instead, we want to make sure that those have costs and have cooldowns and are set up in such a way that that isn't as much of an issue. And then also layer on top of that the abilities to have removals and immunities, so that you can make yourself immune to a certain type of effects for an amount of time.
Did we just add that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
we've had that for a bit.
Okay.
so that those type of things don't become too much of an issue. It sort of is an open question in the longer term of the
We also
game
have
if
the removal.
there will be some sort of a system like that. I'm not too big a fan of diminishing returns just as a baseline system that's present for all type of effects in the game. But I do think that there's definitely some opportunities for immunities for things that are very, very extreme, so that like with the way panic and terror and that kind of effects work, where if you're affected by this type of effect, it affects you, but then you cannot be affected by that again for a certain amount of time. It's not a diminishing return, it's just an immunity timer basically that says you can only be affected by this so often and for so long, so that you're not affected by some crazy powerful crowd control effect just permanently on your character.
I was just thinking about that because we could have the CC effects at their tail end put an active effect on you with an event handler that just aborted subsequent CC effects.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you,
there's
you
a lot of
basically would
ways to
just have
slice it, yeah.
an immunity effect on the end of the
But
effect.
again, that's like for guys who have played lots of PvP games with really abusive crowd control systems, like that's Ben could put in CC immunity right now without help from any engineer.
Yeah, Ben could put in what do you they just asked the question. What was the question?
Diminishing returns?
He could put in diminishing returns if you wanted to right now. Like the flexibility's there for all that stuff, but
Yeah, that would be a little bit harder than just straight up immunity timers, but it's
It's a little convoluted.
it's
but
Yeah.
it's something that we
With
could
bounds
we
and-
could work. Yeah,
yeah,
because
yeah.
it would have to have bounds, and it would have to
Exactly.
be aware of the different type of effect that it was. And
Right.
There is some scripting that we could do there to make that happen. It might be a little bit simpler to have some specific code that did that on a ubiquitous level for something
Yeah,
like that. But there are certainly options, and a lot of that will evolve out of actually getting gameplay testing, which is something that we hope to get into in the not too distant future. So that's something we will definitely be keeping a close eye on, because we know how important it is to balance out the negative gameplay side of the control equation.
Vesir asks, about terrestrial transference. If you throw the stone out and then transfer to it while it is in midair, do you continue the flight path that the stone had, or will you mass affect it for a new path, or does the stone just pop up out of the ground?
Right now, and that's more. I can tell you what it does right now, which is you move to the stone with your current physics, velocity, acceleration, and all of that, and the stone moves to where you were with its current position, velocity. So if it's still on its upward arc, it will teleport to wherever you were and continue on its upward arc and then fall down. and if you were standing still, you will just fall out of the sky if it was up in the air somewhere. It has to be up in the air, otherwise it would be a deployed stone.
Valiant Kale asks, will the body part system change? Is the goal to allow left and right legs to be targeted, or will they always be together, as well as will torso always be the default target, or will it be randomized later on?
So that's multiple questions. The torso is a default target. Basically, anything that you don't designate or that doesn't by default hit multiple targets hits the torso, just because that's like the main part of the target's body.
If your goal isn't to handicap a guy, it's to kill the shit out of him.
Yeah, well, you could kill him by hitting him in the head as well, but torso is just a good default thing to use for unspecified attacks.
pretty big and squishy.
Yeah, the part of it about left and right side is something we want to affect based on positionals, which are something we don't have right now as well. We want to be able to be aware of what side of a character or what orientation relative to your target you are on. So if you're standing to the left side of a character and you're attacking them, you're hitting them in either the left arm or the left leg if you're targeting arms or legs, or you're still hitting them in the torso if you're not specifying a target, or you can hit them in the head if you're specifying that as your target. So the only difference there being on the left and right side based body parts, that you will be affected on the side that the attack is coming from. But you won't have to say, I'm attacking the left leg versus I'm attacking the right leg. You'll just be attacking the leg that you're on the side of the character of. And that also will eventually get us when we're doing positionals, things like backstab, which I know is everyone's favorite thing.
Yeah,
Andrew? Oh, go ahead.
that's another thing that We could probably technically do now, but we could also probably just write a helper method. For
Yeah.
Yeah, a helper method.
Because
for
Ben
it
would have to do
probably be better.
radian math in his
Yes.
scripts.
Yes, that is why.
Sines and cosines are a pain. Every time.
More numbers.
Go.
I know, right?
Adric Cortesia asks, will your carrying capacity increase or decrease the amount of being pushed? Like carrying a lot of stuff means less far pushed.
Your carrying capacity won't, but your mass will.
Right.
And the
And
amount
the
of
things
stuff
you
you
are
have.
carrying affect your mass.
There we go.
Will affect your mass.
Dregant asks, will you limit the amount of dots on one type someone can have on them? I never liked that idea.
Okay, so this gets back into the ability interaction system, right? So there isn't like a limit on the number of dots where, or effects. Let's generalize and say effects of a type, right? So if you have multiple effects of a given type, they should combine into a single effect, and resultantly have the properties of the merged effects cumulatively that have been combined together. So then, getting into the system of ability power, you'll have one cumulative effect on you that has the properties of all of those effects, and then if you have something that affects the power of that effect, it will just be reduced in power, so its effects cumulatively will be reduced down. So it's not like you have 5 different dots on you and someone cleansed one of the dots and one of the dots went away. It'll be you have one damage over time effect on you that gets more and more extreme as additional effects get layered into it and combined into that one effect, and then if somebody is cleansing that off of you, it gets reduced in how strong it is, and then instead of just, it's just flat out removed, it's just reduced in power, so it becomes less damaging than it previously was. And some of them might have longer durations, some of them might have shorter durations. They're just all contributing to the same damage and duration of that interval-based periodic effect.
Spike Druid asks, will a stun start over the ability cooldown time because you were reset to a neutral state?
I don't know if I understand that question.
If you get stunned while prepping a skill, what was the actual question part of that?
Will the stun also start over the ability cooldown time, or because the person was reset to a natural state, stunned, once that was over, they could begin attacking again?
So if you get interrupted, does it reset your cooldown to 0 or?
So your cooldown starts at the end of either your preparation or your recovery time, whichever one of those actually, if you get disrupted or if you don't get disrupted. So if you have an ability that has 1 second preparation, 1 second recovery, 5 second cooldown, and you get interrupted halfway through the 1 second preparation time, you then start the cooldown time. So
So it does
when
put
you're
it on
talking,
cooldown at
it
the
does
time
put
of
it on a
interruption.
cooldown. The question then would be if the control effect's duration is longer than the duration of the cooldown, in which case it would work out that it didn't matter that you were stunned.
And I believe, and you can shush me if I'm wrong, but we have more interesting effects that will happen on disruption later.
Right, and so disruption is a whole thing. The specific question was about stun, which is a thing that basically no class in the game actually has for Beta 1 right now. But they do have disruption effects. So if you're taking damage, you're also taking disruption, and that will interrupt your abilities that you're activating without any type of... Well, it can. That's sort of a semantic thing. But your ability has stability. The
Well, I want to be
attacker
clear
has
that
disruption.
just taking damage doesn't automatically mean you get interrupted.
Right. So we're specifically talking about disruption as opposed to damage being a separate property of abilities, right? So the systemic functionality of that is attacks deal damage, can also inflict disruption separately from that. Abilities have a stability amount that is affected by disruption. If the cumulative amount of disruption that you sustain during the preparation time of your ability is greater than your stability, that ability becomes disrupted and basically stops. Eventually, there will be more bad things that happen to you when you have an ability disrupted, such that if you're in the middle of casting a giant fireball, your giant fireball gets disrupted, your fireball explodes in your face. Right now, it just stops and you can, it goes on cooldown, and then after the cooldown, you can start it again. Eventually, more bad things will happen there, such that you really don't want your abilities to be interrupted.
All right. Do you guys want to go to 4:30 or?
We can do it 10 more minutes unless
Yeah.
anybody's dying over here.
No dying.
Okay.
No wussing out. Go.
Fubu asks.
Say that again.
Fubu
Okay.
asks.
It's a great name.
With the new abilities system, it sounds like it is much easier to track down bugs versus before. Is this correct?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's much
And-
easier to implement bugs too.
Yes. Well, which is good, because that means we're implementing fast. Yes, and there's much more logability of everything.
That was one of the main problems that we had with the old ability system was visibility into what just happened.
Ben had
Exactly.
basically no introspection.
Yeah.
into what was
Yeah,
going
yeah.
on.
And so I had started putting it in and realized that it was going to take a ginormous amount of work. So with the new one, we made sure that
The system was built with that in mind.
yeah, and that like there's fairly few probe points of places that need logging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are fairly low. So to get
Few points, lots of data.
yeah,
We
yeah.
also fail a lot louder than we used to.
Yes.
With brightly colored consoles.
yeah.
Which is great.
Basically,
As opposed to just like, you hit the button, nothing happened. Now it's you hit the button, huge massive console spam.
and that's
yeah.
assuming it didn't do that as soon as Ben started the server.
Right,
Correct. We also do validation when they're first loaded.
Yep, and the script compiles say whether they worked and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Yep.
Odilvik asks, we have seen various cool wall spells. Can the height and length of the wall be altered/tailored?
It can now.
It's true. Those are properties of the kinematic, the dimensions, and we'll just have to get a visual component hooked up to those. Walls aren't a big thing right now because we don't have mages as our beta 1 classes, but mages will be doing a lot more interesting persistent area things and stuff that's like that, basically like they had walls before. And so we'll get into a lot more crazy things when we implement our mage classes that will push our ability system even further than it has been
man.
right now.
We could even do like multi-shape ones, so it's like you can make a corner, or you can have one like it's a T-junction if it's Monday, or
I see.
Or an
The,
M
di-
for
the day of
Monday
the
and a
week
T.
moves it down the Tetris block.
Yeah.
we could have one that's a clock that updates live.
Sacrix asks, will CC be applied to the layers? Anything on how diminishing returns may factor into this?
CC being applied on layers.
The power of it presumably will be driven off an LAE.
And the duration.
layers will apply. Yeah, and duration. All the numbers involved.
All the
with it.
stats.
Yeah.
Numbers all go through LAEs was kind of the summary of the LAE
And
presentation.
all those numbers can be buffed and debuffed.
And so you could have like an innate resistance to CC as a bane or a boon or something like that, and you could have a buff or a debuff that does that. That all happen on different layers.
Yeah, like
Or not.
the way
Or not.
that the resistance system works is actually by effect type. Right now it's basically by damage because we don't have power, but eventually it will be based on power. So the effects of a crowd control, let's say, if it's based on, say, frost, the effect of that power will go down based on your frost resistance. So it will slow you for less, it will stun you for less, it will deal damage for less. All of those things will go down based on your resistance. So in that way, the layers really matter because the resistance to that is based on buffs, it's based on armor, it's based on all of these things.
Esidar asks, does your script system allow for hot loading and updating the game with no downtime?
Yes.
No.
What?
Reload nodes.
Reload node still works.
That works. It doesn't work on debug machines
Oh.
It doesn't work on
Only
debug
doesn't work
machines?
for me.
because of the different folders. Because
Oh.
it gets copied out to Ben.
If we
Oh,
put the
we can-
files in the right place, it works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's supposed to work.
There's
Yeah.
it does work on our live servers, but basically when we're working on a local debug server, it copies all of our files to a different place, and so it reloads from a different place than we
Final
work
fix
on
it.
them.
Also, reload nodes was a little
Today I
ham-fisted
learned
and too big.
bitch about something on stream, and Marc will fix it.
Have somebody ask.
Oh,
You
in
just
that
planted that
case-
person, right?
Totally,
Tim's account.
totally not Tim asks.
Get them to ask about generic immutables.
No. No, I'm not doing that. So that doesn't always work apparently. I probably should do
Sacrix
that,
has
too.
a further question about
So much
CC
effort.
and layers.
I know.
Will it be directly connected to abilities, or will it mostly be via trauma on wounds?
CC is
Crowd
pretty much
control.
ability driven, right? There's not a whole lot of CC traumas.
Leg.
Well, so it depends on what your definition of CC is, right? Because if everything that negatively affects the performance of your character is CC, like, is movement speed reduction CC? Well, kind of, because it controls your character's ability to move. And if you take leg wounds, you move slower. Is it CC when you lose attack speed from taking damage and sustaining a wound to your arms? Like, it's a very fuzzy. It depends on what you mean. Like, so there are some of those effects that detrimentally reduce the performance of your character from trauma. Trauma effects, though, are brief effects that happen after you sustain wounds. They go away if that wound gets immediately cured, or they last a brief duration and then they expire. So I wouldn't expect you to be under those effects just constantly. It's something that will periodically pop up when these wounds happen.
Well, that being said, something like old-style bomb groups that do lots of damage will have sort of implicit CC built into that. Right?
Yeah, there is some implicit control built into the game, such that guys who are getting real beat up don't perform as well as when they were at full health. So I think that will allow for some interesting gameplay implications. And just as well,
there are other
some
games
things
where, like, when your health goes below half, you start moving slower.
Yeah, and that's sort of what that effectively entails, except that it doesn't last forever. So if you end up in a situation where your character is very, very wounded, but you disengage from a fight, all that stuff will eventually fall off after a little while, so you won't be just permanently slowed and stuck
the
in the middle of
wounds.
nowhere. But the wounds will stay, right? Your max health.
You're still feeble and at risk.
You're still at risk. Your performance
not
is
so
back
much
up.
feeble, yeah.
Yeah,
You're fragile.
It's a very clear distinction there. Your character's performance remains okay, but your max health is much lower, so you're still very much in danger if you don't get those wounds cleaned up somehow.
That being said, I think the second sort of implicit part of his question was, will there be CC that exists outside of traumas?
That exists outside of traumas, definitely.
I think we have some of that now with there's some slowdown.
Yeah, there's
Stuff.
Yeah, but
We have
I assume him coming from games like Dark Age, he's specifically asking about stun, root, and mez, something like that. And I don't know that we want to go that deep into those right now, but we don't have any of those specific systems. Well, we've got root.
We got root.
There is the Forest Stalker, I think, has a brief root ability,
Yeah.
which is supposed to be based on one of his plant abilities that's not currently implemented the way it was originally designed. But there's some abilities in there that do perform some basic control functionality. And again, I am much more in favor of things like slow as opposed to things like root.
Less binary
things like,
crowd control.
Yeah, things like attack speed reduction versus things like disarm,
Or
so
silence.
that or silence, so that you have some penalties there that make your character less effective, but not necessarily totally ineffective.
But it could be interesting just to have something like a silence effect that only affects one skill track, so you could still use like
Yeah,
your
and
left arm or
that's
something like
effectively
that.
what silence would be versus disarm, right?
Exactly.
All right, I'm looking for a final question. Here,
Yeah, you guys
folks.
got like 2 minutes, so come up with a damn good one.
Ideally, a question that maybe everybody on the couch would have an answer to would be a nice one to end on, like their own answer. So go ahead and if you have a nice kind of final wrap-up question, post that in the chat for me. In the meantime, going down the list, Odilvik asks, with a best/worst case scenario, how close to a one-shot kill are you aiming for?
I'm so not touching that. Have fun.
So right now, I think the highest damaging abilities in the game on a character that is not wearing any armor can take out up to about a quarter of your health. But a character that's wearing armor can get, 75% damage reduction. So if you're wearing armor, if you have buffs and debuffs, if you have healing, all of these things, it should really cut down on the total amount of damage. So I don't think that you'll run into any situation where you will get one-shotted by a single ability. If you are wearing very light armor and you're in a very big fight and you get focused, you might die very, very quickly. But that's always going to be the case unless our
It's a
time to
consequence
kill.
of war.
It is. It's a consequence of the scalability of our game, right? Where we're trying to have these really big fights. So I don't think there's any way, unless we had a time to kill that was just obscenely long, and 1v1 fights were just kind of out the window. that you would be able to avoid getting insta-give by large numbers of players.
Right.
Everybody, shoot your arrows at that one dude.
That's pretty much all.
Yeah.
Ryer C asks, what is your favorite part of the new system, future or present?
Start that way.
Okay.
I like
Math.
I like the scripting because it's so little code that I actually have to write.
So
Just
I-
more XML you have to write.
So now I can't use scripting.
Damn
You
it!
stole his
You
thing,
can
you
use scripting
kid.
if you want.
You could say the same thing.
You could use it for a different reason. Because it's less code you have to write.
Yeah. I kind of like the way we built. This is the way we built it. How we made sure and we prototyped. I mean, we went kind of through 3-4 mini iterations of how we built everything. I mean, the core kind of stayed the same, but like how we were putting together the XML, what parts were a script or a number coming in versus hard-coded, things like that. We kind of kept iterating on that while we were building examples, which was sometimes frustrating, especially for Rob, and mostly for Rob. But we iterated through that, and I think we got a very flexible system, and it's starting to pay off with all these things that, before would take a half day and now take 30 minutes. It's just, we can now iterate a lot faster, we can build things a lot faster, etc. So I like that.
I think the part that I value the most, and as Mark was saying, we didn't really change the design of the game through rehabilitation. It's something we keep saying, but I think everyone needs to remain aware of that. It's like, this was really a technical refactor, something that we needed to do in order to get the functionality that we had originally wanted. Not that we changed our mind in what we wanted to build, we just are building it differently to make it better. And the part that's better the most to me, I think, is the speed of iteration, so that when I go through and make an ability, I can immediately be like, oh, I don't think that this should work this way, or I wanted to do this slightly differently. I don't have to be like, oh, but that would take a lot of code that somebody has to actually write that will take weeks before I get it, because it has to go into someone's queue, and then it has to get addressed, and then it'll get finished, and then it might not work right, so it has to go back, and then it has to get code reviewed, and then it has to, all of these things that have to happen really can just happen in a script. Or I can go up to Rob and be like, hey Rob, make this thing happen in this way instead of the way that it currently does, and he can turn around those things really, really fast.
Oh, yeah.
Typically. So
because there's so little code I have to
because
write.
there's so little code, and so that allows us to iterate on things really fast, to where, once we get into testing especially, and once we start really using some of these abilities in concert with each other within the context of group battles, which is something, I don't know how most of this stuff is going to work when it comes to that. I can have ideas and theories, but people will start using them and be like, this is amazing, or this is terrible, and we'll be able to address that very, very quickly and go like, oh, this should be changed like this, and make that change and have it ready for testing, within the same week probably. So that'll be something really, really good that will benefit the system a lot.
Yeah, kind of riffing on that, like I have done a lot of prototyping with this system, and I really like these small rapid iterations, and not just speed, but like I've watched as the system has matured. Once we got stuff in like scripting and LAEs, there was a little bit of growing pain as we went from like as we went from like prototype system to actual like production system with all of this flexibility and all of this power. Like there was a couple of really big refactors, but like once we got through that, it would be like, hey, I need this new feature. I'm going to go operate on that feature and the specific components that it touches, and I don't need to reinvent the whole frigging planet to add a really small feature. And so the not just the speed of iteration, but the scope of iteration has been really, really nice, which has also allowed us to have a handful of people working on a bunch of different systems at the same time without stepping on each other, because they had to do these broad, sweeping, wide iterations. And so being able to actually also come together and work as a team and work together instead of stepping on each other's toes has been really, really cool.
All right. Well, that seems like a good way to end it. We
Yay.
have one more thing that we have to do before this stream is over, which is the ritual. Hold it at the
yes.
bottom.
Yeah, you may want to.
I thought we were lighting me on fire.
We're lighting you on fire. The candle is part of you now.
Yes.
So there we go.
We've added a
We lit Rob on fire, as promised.
I'm gonna go make that now.
And yes, thanks again, and join us for more streams tomorrow, including the wrap up with MJ, the week wrap up with MJ tomorrow afternoon.
It's gonna burn your
So yes,
finger.
see you later.
See.
Bye bye.